So let's get started. So welcome everyone. I am Tauhidur Rahman. I am the director of the Initiative for Agency and Development, which is university-wide initiative at University of Arizona. And we aspire to be like Brookings institution of a university. So this is something. So today I'm really pleased to have Amelie Gustafsson-Wright from Brookings institution. All of you I have shared her bio data with you and her work. So you are quite familiar with who she is, but just to little bit, not to make her a little bit uncomfortable or put some pressure. Amelie is a senior fellow at Center for Universal Education at Brookings Institution. She's an applied microeconomist and particularly in the context of education and health, especially in developing countries. Without exaggeration, she is the world authority on financing mechanism, including payment by results, public-private partnerships, and impact investing, particularly in the area of social development impact. What I especially like about her work, in recent work particularly, which is especially that how to scale up early childhood education and development programs in developing countries, which is around the world. For this audience, it is very clear that it is one of the frontiers of international development policy challenges today. So, and Amelie has been spearheading it this globally while she is at Brookings Institution. Over the last 20 years and more so, she has worked at all who is who, including World Bank, UNICEF, and many others. Amelie got her PhD from Tinbergen Institute, which is one of the most premier institute. It used to be called Econometrics Institute, right? And first Nobel laureate, Jen Tinbergen. So, and she has a master's in finance and bachelor's in economics from University of California, Santa Barbara. She is one of the most quoted economists today, particularly in media outlets like Wall Street Journal, Economics, and Financial Times. So I'm really, really pleased that Amelie is today here, and she's going to talk about innovative financing for development and global education. So before I ask Amelie to take over, just for the logistics, if everyone please have your questions for the end, because since this is a Zoom talk, and so at the end we will have a lot of time for questions and sessions. So you raise your hand using the Zoom feature, and then you can directly ask her. So with that, Amelie, thank you for joining us from Washington, DC, and now the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm assuming most of you are in Arizona, is that right?
Not really.
No?
A lot of people, yes. Some of them are from Africa as well.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Great. So I would, I'd love to, if you want to put who you are in the chat, I'd love to see that as we're jumping off into questions, and definitely introduce yourselves and what you do and where you come from, because I would love to hear. So yes, I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and I have been working in the innovative financing space for a long time. I spent many years doing impact evaluation work, including of innovative financing mechanisms. About a decade ago, I started researching one particular innovative financing mechanism called social and development impact bonds. I'll start off with, of course, now my screen is not. But there we go. So I'll start off with a primer on social and development impact bonds. I assume that some of you are familiar, but just to make sure everybody's on the same page. And then I'll give some examples of impact bonds and outcomes funds. And then we'll present some of our research on the success of impact bonds thus far, what we've seen in the space across 5 different dimensions of success. And then we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A. So I like to start with sort of innovative financing more broadly. And again, I'm not going to go into other types of innovative financing mechanisms today, because we certainly wouldn't have time for that. I'll dive into social development impact bonds, but just to sort of place them in a bigger picture of innovative financing. So we usually talk about innovative financing kind of in two categories: innovative sources of financing and innovative ways of delivering that financing. So in the innovative sources side, we have things like sin taxes or airline taxes, carbon auctions, consumer donations, corporate social responsibility, as well as impact investors. These can, of course, cross over. So, for example, impact investors may engage in some of these others that you see on the right. And then on the innovative delivery mechanisms, that can be split into two types: non-contingent disbursement of financing and contingent disbursement. So on the non-contingent disbursement side, we have things like bonds and notes, guarantees, concessionary loans, unconditional cash transfers. And then on the contingent disbursement side, different types of results-based financing, and I'll go into that in the next slide a little bit more in detail. Prizes and awards, conditional cash transfers, and social and development impact bonds, which will, as I said, we'll focus on today. So results-based financing is quite messy in terms of terminology. The key thing to know is that the way that they differ primarily is who it is that holds the financial risk if some results are not achieved. So, so we have in the far left-hand column who it is that holds that financial risk or the contingency for payment, and then the next column, like a broad terminology for the results-based financing instrument category, and then the instruments. So there are a lot of acronyms in this space, and you'll see that we use the term RBF. We also use the term OBF, outcomes-based financing, and I'll explain a little bit more kind of how those differ. But again, so you can see that these different types have, for the first category, it's the national government that holds that financial risk, then local government, service providers in performance-based contracts, investors and outcomes-based financing, which is what we'll talk about today, and then beneficiaries and conditional cash transfers. So, so basically, if some results aren't delivered, these parties will not get some promised payment. All right, so yeah, again, focusing on that. So what is an impact bond? I usually describe impact bonds as a confluence of three things: impact investing, a public-private partnership, and results-based financing or payment by results. So here is a sort of a definition. It's a form of results-based financing in which a risk investor provides service providers with capital for some type of social or environmental services, and then those investors are repaid or paid their principal plus some return by so-called outcome funders if some agreed upon outcomes have been achieved. So here is a nice little diagram that helps to illustrate that. So as I said, investors provide risk capital. Upfront is not quite the terminology. It can be upfront. It can also be provided in tranches to the service providers to deliver the services to some population in need. And then an independent evaluator verifies whether or not those outcomes, some agreed upon outcomes, have been achieved. And then the so-called outcome funder, which in the case of a social impact bond or SIB is government. And in the case of a DIB or development impact bond, that would be a third party like a foundation or a donor agency like the World Bank or USAID, for example. That outcome funder pays the investor back their principal plus some return. So investor provides the capital, service providers deliver the services, and evaluation is done. Outcomes are achieved, investor paid back plus some return. If they aren't, they can potentially not be paid back at all, or they can be paid a portion, depending upon how the agreement or contracts are set up. And then you have outcomes funds, which are they're kind of like they bring together multiple impact bonds. So it's a way of pooling funding for multiple impact bonds. And this is a way that we've seen to sort of scale impact bond projects, which you'll see soon, is that they have tended to be quite small. They're growing, but they tended to be quite small. So this concept of an outcomes fund was developed in the UK, which is where impact bonds were, invented in 2010 with the first impact bond that was that aimed at reducing prison recidivism. So that was in the UK, and then these outcomes funds came out of that. So the first one had 10 different impact bonds within it. And so here you can see the definition for what an outcomes fund is. So you would have multiple service providers and potentially multiple investors that are part of this broader project. So just some thoughts on kind of the theory or why, or what one could think. So outcomes-based financing or impact bonds could help to address some global challenges. Obviously, there are a number out there that need to be addressed. So one piece of it is that the outcomes focus can help to improve the likelihood of addressing development needs. Because you have clearly defined and measurable outcomes, because service providers have the flexibility to tailor interventions to learners, as this is education focused, but to the beneficiaries and the context. Also has the potential to strengthen the ecosystem. Among the service providers for the outcome funders, may it be government or donors or foundations. And then, paying only if outcomes are achieved is an opportunity to utilize limited budgets wisely. So a couple of examples so you can get a feel for what these look like. So the Quality Education India DIB ran from 2018 to 2022. We were actually the knowledge partner for this impact bond. It was the second impact bond in India for in the education sector, and was considerably larger. It targeted 200,000 students in low-fee private schools across 4 states in India. There were 4 different service providers, and the UBS Optimus Foundation was the investor, and then you had a number of other players who were involved. They had a number of other goals, besides just the achievement of the outcomes, which included, building the evidence around these different types of interventions, building the capacity of the service providers, obviously optimizing the spending. So there you can see the different types of services that were provided across these different service providers. And here's the diagram of which relates to the one I just showed you on how impact bonds work, or the flow of the capital. So the risk investors, UBS Optimus, provided the working capital to the implementation partners, and who provide the services, and then the outcome funders paid the investors back. And we'll get to the outcomes for that one shortly, I'll show. So the outcome funding was over $9 million over 4 years, and then the investors committed over $3 million. So that capital was recycled each year. So when they're after a success, if outcomes were achieved after 1 year, investors were paid back and they reinvested into the program. They're not all set up like that, but some are. All right, so here's an example of an outcomes fund. So this is newly launched, and this is really interesting in general in the outcomes-based financing space, in particular for in the education space, which I focus on primarily. Although I do, we keep a database of all the impact bonds in the world across all sectors and across high, middle, and low income countries, which I'll show you shortly. But this one is really interesting. It reaches a large number of children across 5 different service providers, 4 of which have investors who are providing the risk capital. One is providing their own risk capital, so that one is not technically an impact bond. But we include it here. The impact investors are Bridges Outcomes Partnerships, which is based in the UK. You have a number of outcome funders, including FCDO, the former DFID of the UK, as well as a number of foundations and bilaterals. And then the intermediary is the Education Outcomes Fund. So they're looking at learning gains in terms of literacy and numeracy. And an average increase in the children meeting the minimum competencies.
¿La papaya estaba muy dañada?
No maduró.
Hi, there's somebody who I think needs to go on mute.
O sea, el centro estaba medio rojita, pero afuera.
Está dañadita.
All right, so so when thinking about sort of, does this make sense using this outcomes-based financing, it's helpful to ask a couple questions. So I talked about multiple types of innovative financing, and I talked about multiple types of results-based financing. And so if a service provider or a donor or any party that might be engaged or might be thinking about engaging in outcomes-based financing or impact bonds, the first question is really, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And sometimes we see sort of a hammer looking for a nail. People get very excited about this innovative financing mechanism, and they think it's going to solve all of their problems, and it certainly is not the panacea, and makes sense in some context and to solve some problems, and definitely not for others. So the first question is, do you think that paying for outcomes is more likely to get you outcomes than paying for inputs? If paying for inputs is going to get the outcomes that you want to see, by all means, pay for inputs. This is complicated and potentially costly, and definitely not necessary if you're already, if you're getting the outcomes that you want to see based on the inputs, based on paying for the inputs or activities. But if it's likely that outcomes are more likely to be achieved if you set up this type of mechanism, then the second question is, do the service providers need the risk capital, or could they benefit from strengthening capacity around monitoring and evaluation, service delivery, performance management, etc. And if so, then potentially impact bonds might make sense. And if not, then traditional payment by results or traditional results-based financing might be a better option. And there are a few other things to think about. We just talked about sort of, is it the right tool? But there are other things like legal and political feasibility. Is this going to float, like from a political standpoint? Is it actually possible for an outcome funder to pay for outcomes after the fact? Do the outcome funders have administrative capacity? Do the service providers have the capacity? Are there data available, to be able to sort of collect data along the way to figure out if things are working or not working? Are there data available to collect to measure whether or not outcomes have been achieved? And then finally, the presence of committed champions. And this is definitely not a minor part of this. I think that it can be complex, and it's really important that there be committed champions, and that they're going to be around for a while. If you're going to have a change in administration, and those committed champions will disappear, which we have seen in a number of cases of impact bonds that didn't come to, they spent a long time setting them up and then they didn't launch because of a change in administration. So those are all some things to think about. And I can talk later about sort of, or in other elements around kind of when does it make sense or not make sense. But I'll jump in now to sort of what do we know about the success of impact bonds thus far. So this is based on a series of policy briefs that we published now a couple of years ago. So it's slightly outdated, but we're continuing to see the similar trends. It's outdated in terms of like the detailed data, but as far as trends, we're seeing really similar things. So I was often being asked, are impact bonds successful? And my answer was, you know, it's not a yes or no question, and it's much more complex than that. And I think that it's much more nuanced, that we should think about that question in a much more nuanced way. And so we looked across these 5 dimensions. So the first is the market size. So, you know, kind of the scope of impact bonds. The second is beneficiaries reached. So how many and who are being reached. Third, the outcome achievement and investor repayments. And then fourth, what we call the ecosystem effects. And then fifth, some thinking around sort of the costs versus the benefits. So the size and the scope. So almost 240 impact bonds have been contracted across 39 countries. Of those, 222 are social impact bonds, meaning that at least one of the outcome funders, as I mentioned before, is government. And then 17 of those are development impact bonds. Let me clarify here again, because I forgot to do it earlier. So the term development impact bond came about with the idea that social impact bonds could be used in low and middle income country contexts. And I think that those who developed the term perhaps assumed that low and middle income country governments would be unwilling or unable to be the outcome funders in these projects. And so the definition sort of became developing country and a third party being the outcome funder. So a little bit, it kind of makes sense until you have actually government outcome funders in low and middle income countries. So we also see social impact bonds in low and middle income countries. Again, as I said, the terminology in this space is a little bit messy, but that is sort of what we're stuck with. I should have mentioned also that in the US, the term is used pay for success term that is used is pay for success financing. We have outcomes contracts being used in parts of Europe, social benefit bonds in Australia, and they are not bonds. So the term impact bonds is very confusing, but we're continuing to use it because it's being used. But we do talk about outcomes-based financing more broadly, also sometimes outcomes contracts. There has been, as you can see, in the past sort of few years, a pretty big so the number of impact bonds has increased. There was a slowdown in the contracting during the pandemic, and we're starting to see an uptick now. So I expect that blue line to go up. And just to give a sense of, you know, how big these are, and I'll go into these in a minute, in terms of the upfront capital invested. And again, these data are pretty, we maintain a database of all the impact bonds in the world. The data that are the hardest to get is the information about the investment capital and the outcome funding. But for the projects that we have, the total amount that's invested up front is around $460 million, with an average of about 3 million. As I mentioned, sometimes those projects also recycle. So the upfront capital then it represents what was provided up front, but not necessarily the total amount needed as an investment. So where are we seeing most of these impact bond projects? The largest number is in the UK, followed by the US. Also, the Netherlands and Portugal have a large number, and Canada and Australia, as well as India and Colombia. So, and then in terms of sectors, the majority are in the social welfare sector, and that includes such things as programs for homelessness, different types of child welfare programs. And then we have almost just as many in the employment sector, and then that's followed by education and health, and then criminal justice with 14, and that's not really been increasing, even though that was the first sector that impact bonds were developed in, and then just a handful in environment and agriculture. And the ones that are in environment, they tend to call them environmental impact bonds, or EIBs. I try to limit the terminology confusion, so I call them all social impact bonds, but they will define themselves as environmental impact bonds. And in terms of low and middle income countries, there are 27 in low and middle income countries. The majority of those are in the employment sector, followed by health and then education, a couple in social welfare, and a couple in environment and agriculture. So the countries with the most are India and South Africa, Colombia. We've definitely seen a large number. And then there's also a development impact bond in Chile. Again, it's a high income country, so the terminology is a little bit confusing. So that's low and middle income countries. All right, so are they reaching intended populations? So about 3.5 million beneficiaries have received services that have been part of impact bond projects. As you can see, there's a huge range. So there's an impact bond for 10 people, which seems kind of crazy. I think that was in Denmark. And then the largest is 650,000. But the median is 500. So many of these projects are quite small. So good to keep in mind as, I'll talk a little bit more about kind of next steps and where this is going. And then here you can see sort of the number of beneficiaries by country. So the US, Portugal, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Kenya, and India are the only countries that have more than 100,000 total beneficiaries in the country. And then sort of who's being reached in terms of age, in terms of population. So as Tauhidur mentioned, much of my research focuses on early childhood development, although I do also education more broadly, as well as health. And it's actually the reason why I started researching impact bonds, because I was interested in the application to early childhood development in low and middle income countries. Sort of given what we know in terms of the returns to investment in early childhood, sort of thought that we would see more in that space. But but the majority are in sort of youth and young people, and very few for the elderly. So that's interesting to think about in terms of sort of thinking about preventing poor outcomes from happening later on. Initially when impact bonds were conceived of, the idea was sort of, preventing, costly remedial programs or, social services, or where it would hit sort of the social safety net, and an opportunity for monetizable savings. The conversation has shifted a little bit from that. Although remains to be certainly part of the conversation in high-income countries. In low-income countries, that's a tough one because there often aren't remedial services, so there aren't necessarily remedial savings. But anyway, just interesting to see sort of, who it is that's benefiting and where these are. And I think, this is the middle category is like strongly driven by the employment impact bonds sector. So are they delivering outcomes? So first of all, just a sense of sort of the outcome funding size, the total outcome funding over 500 million, and then quite a range between 90,000 and 32 million. In terms of the investment side, also a range, from 10 million to 25. That's without capital recycling, so the recycling back into the project. And then between 30 and 6.2 for those with capital recycling. But as you can see, the ends are very low, very hard. So we have 240 impact bonds. So we're missing about 100 data on about 100 of them. Although I do think that this is fairly representative of what we're seeing. And then in terms of return, huge range, right? Between just over 1% up to about 20%. Again, as you can see, below N, it's hard to get that information. So how many of them have actually led to the pre-decreed outcomes and led to repayment? So again, this is a few years old. We're currently updating our database with projects that have come to a close in the last few years. Hard to get that information. I think as people are coming out of the pandemic, we're hoping to get more information. Some of them have been delayed as well, also as a result of the pandemic. But as you can see, the majority of them led to repayment. The principal plus a positive return. Some of them played back the principal plus a partial return, and just one principal. So, and then there were a number that hadn't made the outcomes public. So, not that many that did not lead to repayment. And then this is just some to give a sense to actually what are we talking about, what kinds of projects and what kinds of outcomes have we seen. So in Cameroon, the Kangaroo Mother Care Development Impact Bond provided Kangaroo Mother Care, which is what's it called? I can't come up with the term, but holding you can imagine a kangaroo holding the baby close, and also education around breastfeeding, etc. And so this was overall in terms of receiving the quality care, almost 30% above the target goal, and then 80% in terms of being exclusively breastfed, which was one of the outcomes. And then appropriate weight gain. So the investor received the principal plus interest. In terms of IBIF, for the Impact Bond Innovation Fund in South Africa, they reached the attendance targets, the recruitment and retention, but did not reach the early childhood development outcomes. They also were hit by COVID, so that was a bit challenging. And then the Utrecht Impact Bond focused on maternal and newborn health, and they were measuring quality of care in small private facilities, and they were successful. The investor was repaid its investment plus a return. Yes, they were able to keep going during COVID. All right, so this is the fourth measure of successive impact bonds. So how do impact bonds affect the ecosystem of social services delivery? So this is sort of the theory of change of, why, and I talked about this a little bit at the beginning. Why would we expect impact bonds to lead to more and better outcomes. So the first piece is the outcomes focus. So instead of focusing on inputs and activities, the focus is on outcomes, and an important piece of that is the investment of the stakeholders to determine what these metrics should be in the design of the impact bond. So getting kind of clarity on what are the outcomes that they want to be seeing. And then that outcomes focus really allows for service providers to innovate, have flexibility to tailor to beneficiary needs, rather than having to, deliver on inputs and activities that they might figure out along the way actually aren't what they need to do to lead to those outcomes. The upfront capital, so the liquidity to deliver services, or at least the capital at the beginning of each of the years, and having that capital also allows for the flexibility to innovate. And then the investor engagement. So obviously the investors want to see a return, but these are impact investors. So, we're not talking generally commercial investors. They want to see both the social good and the financial return. But there's closer attention that's paid to the service delivery during the implementation. Investors or some type of performance management intermediary might engage with service providers to help strengthen capacity, as I mentioned, around monitoring and evaluation. So that leads to improved adaptive management. And then finally, scrutiny on the project. So everyone's looking at this. We're 13 years since the first impact bond, but there's still quite a bit of sort of, scrutiny on the projects, and everybody's watching them closely to see how successful they are. And all the stakeholders have put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get these going. So I think that that's also a piece they care. They want to see the outcomes being achieved. So in terms of the ecosystem effects, I've talked about the monitoring and evaluation, the performance management systems improving, the innovation in service delivery. So not necessarily sort of super risky or like experimental projects, that don't have any evidence behind them, but kind of that innovation along the way. Crowding in private funding, crowding in players that might not have engaged in a particular sector or issue area previously. It doesn't mean that it's more funding per se, because outcome funders have to pay them back. In terms of reducing government risk, we know that for the projects that did not achieve outcomes, that they clearly reduced the risk for government. What we don't know in financial risk, what we don't know is for those that have been successful, we don't know the counterfactual. So, we can say these projects achieved these outcomes, but we can't say what would have happened in the absence of the impact bond. We have seen that these projects really are incentivizing collaboration between public and private sector, across government, across different levels of government, both horizontally and vertically, and also with the service providers. And then in terms of sustained impact, I sort of think of that as all of these things are kind of part of that. We don't know a lot yet about sort of what happens to the cohorts that were part of these projects, what happens to them later. So that's something that hasn't really been followed up. There's other things that have happened, which I call kind of ripple effects, which is, for example, a policy maybe was put in place as a result of the impact bond. And then finally, do the benefits outweigh the costs of impact bonds? There's the effectiveness, which is, have they achieved, which we just talked about, have they achieved the outcomes? Then there's the ecosystem effects, which we just talked about. And then finally, the economic returns, both in terms of personal and social returns. So that's potentially the benefit side. And that's something that's difficult to measure unless, like I said, you have potentially kind of monetizable savings. So that's the benefit side. So these are just things to think about sort of in the question is often asked, are these really costly? And so thinking really about sort of both what are the benefits, but also what are the costs. So, and how do they compare to traditional forms of financing? So you have project design and structuring costs. Those could definitely be higher. You have project implementation and oversight. Those could be or could not be higher, depending on the project, and then the verification and evaluation, and then the cost of capital, which is the return. So just important to sort of think about all of the different components. I think hard in impact bonds, there's quite a bit of there's a lot more transparency around the costs, and so it can also be seem that they're more costly. I think it depends on the design time, and for the early impact bonds, we certainly saw a long design time, which would be costly both in terms of human resources, et cetera. 4 ways to lower costs. So sort of what's being thought of now and moving forward in this space in terms of kind of what's needed. The first piece is really to reduce that time in terms of design, is really building knowledge and sort of generate champions around the financing mechanism to reduce the time. The other way is to pool investment capital. So we're starting to see that, investment funds for outcomes-based financing. And then the third is to create outcomes funds, which I talked about. I gave the example of the education outcomes fund. So pooling funds for a number of projects from potentially from either one government or in partnership with other types of entities. So we're seeing that, for example, with government as well as donors in low and middle income country contexts. And then finally, to do some streamlining of the technical assistance needs. And so that can have to do with the determination of the metrics, evaluation methods, kind of all of the technical details around setting these projects up. So here are just some of our reports. We've written a lot about impact bonds. So if you'd like to learn more, some are focused on particular parts of the world, others are focused on particular issue areas. And one that we published a few years ago that focuses specifically on developing country contexts exclusively, and then others you can see, for example, India and Mexico, and then the series of success briefs. We also did some research on the impacts of the effects of the COVID-19 crisis on impact bonds and how these projects responded in the context of the crisis. All right, so I will stop there.
So thank you, Emily. There's a lot to, you had so much, and so thank you for a great presentation. And now
I'll stop sharing. I'll leave this here for just a minute if anybody wants to take note of contact information and our website with all of the research. We can also put it in the chat.
Can I jump in with a question, please?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting and very novel for someone with a background from academia. So if I can ask a very dumb question, if I have an idea for a project for social impact capacity building in say Colombia, India, Brazil, and knowing that I'm completely naive about this approach, how do I start? Sorry for such a stupid question.
There are no stupid questions. That's a really good question, actually. So it depends on who you are in terms of what hat you're wearing. There are there are a few ways to sort of enter into this space. So, if you're a service provider, for example, then you might look at intermediaries. So you have intermediary parties who help to put these deals together. And so there are a number of those, and we have ones that specialize in different parts of the world. So that's one way. There are, if you are an investor and want to get engaged, there are a number of projects that are sort of in the pipeline. So that could be a place to start. Or if you're an investor that believes in a particular service provider, sometimes it can happen that way, where they say, we're interested in investing in this service provider in this way. If you're a government, you can start the conversation with either, with service providers or with intermediaries directly. There are a lot of different ways of going about it, and sort of different characters who are kind of leading the charge. Yeah.
So I'm a researcher.
Mhm.
I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Medicine. I'm not a physician. I'm a medical informatician statistician.
Okay.
So I guess finding an intermediary partner would be the.
So what would you like to do?
There are a couple of there's a couple of things. So, for example, I'm very interested in using mobile phone based education to and capacity building for not just developing for teaching people how to develop educational and research materials using no code mobile app technology that actually I developed. So the purpose of this, which actually has been tested in Colombia in a medical context, is to provide the capacity for people to develop their own education and patient support materials, and actually maybe even develop business around it. So it's capacity building and so.
Right, but it sounds like you would be a service provider, basically.
I guess, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
At least a service and technology provider. Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you have any evidence behind it?
I do actually. I have some evidence from a couple of studies done in Colombia, one done in India, and to show that that this technology, in its research prototype form, was able to people with 2 days of training were able to develop pretty sophisticated educational materials.
So
in fact, we tested it with high school students once, and they did very well.
So I would point you in the direction of one particular intermediary that actually started off in Colombia, and they worked on the first impact bond, Educate Girls Impact Bond in India.
Okay.
So you might speak with them. I'm happy to. They're called Instiglio. You can look them up.
I'm sorry,
INSTIGLIO.
Okay.
Instiglio, yeah. And they're, as I said, they started off in Colombia, but now they have offices around the world.
Okay. I looked them up and really appreciate the name, and hope I may be able to ask you a question or two later also.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Sriram. Charles, now you're next, please. Yes.
Hi, thank you. My name is Charles Nusser. I'm a faculty member in the economics department. And I have kind of a general question about impact bonds. So I'm wondering if they trade in some kind of secondary market, because if they did, the price would reflect the market's belief in how successful in the probability of success of the project in achieving its goals. And I guess, I mean, that's kind of there's kind of a risk that if that price is too low, it might engender pessimism about the possibility of achieving the goal. On the other hand, if the price is high, it would engender optimism and maybe attract, more investment in the project. So are they not allowed to trade?
Yeah,
Or-
because they're not actually, like, they aren't really an asset class of their own. They're,
Okay.
it's a contractual mechanism. That being said, in Australia, there were some projects where they could be sold, like, they could be sold by the investors, but it's not in a traditional.
Okay, but generally when they're created, there's a clause that can't be resold. They're just held until the outcome is resolved or determined.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. But
it's a really good question. Yeah, and we might see, there's a hope as these grow that, part of the problem is that the projects have been very small. And so, commercial investors, this is just like tiddlywinks for them, right? And so, but as they grow and as we have these investment funds that are being developed, there's the potential that they, there's a thing about the risk, though. There's like a tension between sort of, if it's really not very risky, do you really need to be doing this? Right. And so it's like, there's like some kind of like a sweet spot of it. It's sufficiently risky that it makes sense to shift that risk from the outcome funder to an investor. But if it's, but those tend to be impact investors, right? Who are, not, who are willing to take a lower return. We saw some extreme levels of return there, but that's not the, those are outliers. So yeah, is this going to go mainstream? Don't know. It's been 13 years, hasn't happened, but yeah.
Okay, thanks.
T-Man.
I think I saw Prashit come.
Okay.
Earlier, I wasn't sure.
Okay, Prashit, go ahead.
Thank you, Emily, for this wonderful presentation. I'm postdoctoral researcher at Augusta University in Georgia. My question is, nowadays, a lot of healthcare systems are moving towards, value-based purchasing. So have you seen any examples in these kind of projects where they have actually incorporated principles of value-based care or value-based purchasing while defining outcomes?
Do you mean sort of around the cost effectiveness? Like, are they using principles of like benchmarks around cost effectiveness?
Yeah, specifically for drugs or, then defining any health outcomes in terms of mortalities or something else.
So do you mean sort of like broader returns to society, or is that what you mean? Or do you mean, are they using benchmarking around like, cost effectiveness studies?
I mean both ways, because those kind of, principles can be applied in both contexts. So any examples on both fronts?
Yeah, so the pricing of the outcomes is really interesting, and I think it's also evolving. I think in the early days, there were probably a lot of back of the envelope calculations that were being done, right? So I sort of see like the costs, they're kind of two pieces of it. Like, what does it cost to deliver these outcomes? And what's the cost of inaction? So what happens if you don't invest in the achievement of these outcomes? And that so the price for that outcome should be some combination of those, right? As I showed in the slide around the benefits, right? So you have the potential effectiveness. The challenge is kind of, how do you value, for example, how do you value the ecosystem effects? Like, you know, perhaps there's some important system strengthening that's happening. How do you value that? And then, you know, only if you have, I mean, you can, there are some like increased labor productivity, or for example, that could be used, but other types of like reduction in, like I was talking about, monetizable savings can be challenging, in particular in low-income contexts. So that was a long way to say that I think attempts are being made to do benchmarking, to be thinking about all of these questions. But yeah, there's certainly a lot that's happening in that space, but it's not sort of like necessary. I would say there are not sort of necessarily standards of practice around that yet that are across all of the projects.
Okay, thank you.
Eamon, now you can go.
You, Professor in economics here. First to Charles' question, are these bonds publicly traded? Sometimes, for example, ING has used existing bonds from Colombia and bought those at a discount and then used those for social impact. So some bonds are initiated through for social impact, but some other times bonds are actually publicly traded and they're then used, for example, by ING. So that's also development that's going on in the private sector. That's actually rather interesting. So that's a comment. And the question, I did some work for microcredit at the World Bank. And one criticism of microcredit is that the process is too bureaucratic, that it does not have the flexibility of traditional lenders, and therefore the people who lend money hardly benefit from the microcredit because of all the bureaucracy. So could you say a little bit more about the timeline that you think is needed for these impact bonds?
In terms of the project development?
Yes.
Yeah, so as I said, for many of the early impact bonds, so the first impact bond I mentioned was developed in the UK in 2010, and then the first two that were launched in low and middle income countries was 2015. So that means that we have sort of 8 years of history of 27 projects and 8 years of history in low and middle income country contexts. Some of these have taken like several years to develop. Others have taken 6 months. I think that we will increasingly see a shorter timeline, especially for the sort of repeat actors, those who are doing this again. Not necessarily for sort of the new actors, even though like a lot has been learned and we have some things that are more standardized, but there's not a lot of sharing and information, I think, and transparency like around contracts. You have obviously lawyers who are writing these contracts, and some of them are doing so on a pro bono basis. So yeah, it's hard to say. It's true. I mean, some of the feedback, we've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of stakeholders in these projects over the last almost decade. And, you know, certainly one of the comments of service providers is the resources, the time and resources it takes for them to be involved in setting this up. I do think it will improve. And I do think that sort of these outcomes funds will help to address that, because they're sort of bigger projects with standardized processes. So, but certainly it's a really good point, and it's definitely something that we've heard from some of the service providers. But they're sort of, you know, they're willing to engage, because if things go well, it really can lead to positive, or you know, improvement in terms of their reputation, right? So. So they also have reputational risk if things don't go well. But if they go well, everybody's seen, oh, they delivered outcomes, and then they're perhaps likely to get more funding. And that in fact happened with the service provider for the first impact bond in education in India, the Educate Girls impact bond. That service provider ended up getting an enormous amount of funding as a result. So
Interesting. Thank you.
mhm.
Heather, now you can go.
Actually, Brad Dreyfus.
Okay.
Yes, we're both at University of Arizona. I'm in emergency medicine and public health, and we both have been working with colleagues in Uganda developing emergency care training in the rural areas since about 2009, 2010, with significant impact. And the funding part is what we struggled with and having challenges with. And this is while working with the Ministry of Health. My question would be, how do you best see approaching the topic of putting together these impact investment bonds with both the NGO and the Ministry of Health, or ministries, the government ministries, to then make sure that this really benefits the stakeholders involved as well as the service providers? And yeah, what's the best strategy that you've seen work and getting this rolling, as opposed to traditional aid or traditional grants?
Yeah, I guess the question is sort of going back to my slide on kind of the decision tree. So like it shouldn't be an only is more money is needed question. It's about sort of, is there an opportunity to yes, to get that funding and perhaps de-risk it for the outcome funder, if it's the government, but also like, is there an opportunity to, through this process, improve service delivery, right? So that means that there's kind of room to grow. And, I guess the question is, like, is the Ministry of Health, like, sounds like they're not willing to pay for whatever the services are. Would they be willing to pay for outcomes, right? Would they, like, are they not willing to take that risk? But if outcomes were achieved, would they be willing to take that risk? Yeah, so certainly there's a lot of information that needs to be shared, and a pretty big kind of like learning process, I think, for all of the stakeholders involved. Yeah, maybe we could take it offline, because there's a lot I have to say about that, but it sounds like it's a possibility. I mean, sometimes I would need to hear more about like the actual intervention and, et cetera, but it sounds like it's potentially interesting, and there are a lot of questions. I guess I'm not sure if that's very helpful, but
that's very helpful. My only follow-on question would be, for those of us who are looking to move our careers more towards impact assessment and doing it in a much more thoughtful way, community-based. This is where Heather, my partner Heather, who's here as well, where we're actually moving our careers. What is the best way to get involved with folks who are needing more impact assessment, especially community-based?
Yeah. I mean, gosh, what I do think is that there is going to be an increase in demand for impact measurement moving forward, because I really do think that the outcomes-based financing, results-based financing space is going to continue to grow. Like, budgets are limited. We're living in a risky environment. Like, there are a lot of factors that I think will lead to that. And I think that's sort of the impact evaluation movement, kind of, early 2000s impact evaluation movement, the growth of impact investing, the need to see impact, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I mean, there are a number of sort of operations that do impact measurement, impact evaluation kind of work. I'm not super familiar with sort of community-based. I'm an economist and I come from sort of that perspective, but I've also worked very closely with medical doctors and in impact evaluation. So we've worked together, but you know, I think that also in these projects, like they're looking for evaluators. I guess, you know, the question is sort of, are there opportunities for you to engage with local actors, and you know, in a way that sounds like you want to be doing, as like in a community-based way. So I don't know. Again, I don't know if that's a very, very clear answer, but I think you're on the right path, and you have the right idea, and I, you know, certainly are opportunities to do so. And again, happy to talk with you both offline more if you're sure.
So Emily, before I have one question before, a lot of questions are there, so just I will ask. So one thing, this is more general question, is that you talked about limitations and criticisms of impact investing and impact bonds. One is that you have to be very clear about the outcomes, right? So this impact investing, these bonds works where you know already what outcomes you are looking for and within what timeline. And even though you talked about the ecosystem impact, right, or sustained impact. So in impact investing, you're talking about just quantifiable immediately at the conclusion of the project. What are the outcomes? So you do not consider into what is the long-term impact. So like medium-term impact, and maybe some projects, there is a hiccup within the life cycle of a project, the impact is not realized, but the infrastructure is set up, and then the impact are likely to be increasing over time or sustained. So what is your view on that? Second one was, this is just general, is there any concern? I mean, the kind of, you are looking at the universe of projects around the world. Has been any concern that particularly in area of early childhood education or health or people who are at risk, that in those circumstances, one of the issue is the infrastructure is generally very poor, you know, that inputs are lacking, basic infrastructure is lacking. And now here you come up with this kind of mechanism, you know, an instrument, and the focus is on outcome. It is quite possible that sometimes outcomes can be achieved because that is what you are focusing on, without creating and establishing the needed critical infrastructure and inputs that is important for the long term. So just general.
Yeah, two really good questions. So the first one, so most of these projects are run about 3 to 5 years. Many of them are measuring each year. So they're measuring along the way to see, and like I said, sometimes those payments are made on a year-by-year basis. Generally, it's a cohort that there's sort of, there's an end goal by a certain, within a certain timeline for like a particular age group. And again, so I mean, we can talk about like in the employment sector, you know, it tends to be employed 6 months, employed 12 months, maybe employed 18 months. Do they continue to follow them later? I mean, generally, like they're sort of in the system of the service provider, so they might be followed, but like the project itself ends in terms of like, does it, as the success, you know, was it successful or not? Did they get gainful employment for a sustained period of time, which is 12 or 18 months or something. But Yeah, so indeed, we don't know what happens to these people afterwards, and what happens to the, if say it's young children, or hopefully again, they're, if it's a child welfare program, perhaps they're still in the system and they're being monitored. But as far as the impact bond project itself, generally not. But as I mentioned, there's sort of other ways to think about sustainability, which is, are things happening within the system as a result of this that may impact many cohorts to come? And I think that's a really interesting one. And, and I think as an impact investor, that's a really compelling case, right? So you're not just having an impact on this cohort that will achieve the outcomes within this project, but perhaps many cohorts to come, right? And then the other types of things that I mentioned, like in the state of Utah, for example, there was a social impact bond for pre-K, pre-primary, and there really wasn't much appetite for having universal pre-K in the state of Utah. But as a result of demonstrating that there were actually monetizable savings, fiscal savings, that became more attractive to politically to certain politicians, and pre-K was made universal across the state of Utah. So so there are some interesting cases like that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Did I answer? Well, and the second
one was, yeah, second one was, if you can, second one was about that focusing on outcomes, particularly in certain critical area, for example, early childhood education or health. Those are the areas where you need investment in inputs.
Oh, infrastructure.
Is there any?
So I would say that for the projects that we're seeing, they are fairly, they're fairly strong service providers. Like the ones that are being chosen are fairly strong service providers that have the infrastructure, and so and that might be built up as part of it. Yeah, I actually thought you were going to ask the cherry picking question, which is, are they sort of focusing on the easiest to reach?
I mean, that is of course true, right? So
that's another question. That's another question. Maybe somebody else has that question, but it is important to note that that is possible, but most of the projects are designed such that doesn't happen. So it can be specifically designed so that it has to do with change over time, distance traveled, as opposed to absolute measures, et cetera, and potentially incentives put in place for the hardest to reach or most marginalized, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Hemant, please ask. Are you there?
Yes. So hi, Emily. Thank you for this insightful presentation. So I work in the strategy planning field at Federal Express, and so on one of the slides you had that these impact bond initiatives in UK was around 73, while in the US it was in the 20s. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on why that is the case. Like, even if we ignore the investment size, it appears that there is more interest in UK as compared to US. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, one, this is where it started. So they had a head start, but also the government has been very supportive. So they even set up a center on impact bonds within the government. They also have used these outcomes funds, so multiple impact bonds within these outcomes funds. So that also dramatically increases the number. But and then there are a number of sort of both investors and of service providers that have really engaged early on and that have been really active. Yeah, I think that and they've sort of put in place, there's actually in our policy brief, the first policy brief on the size and scope, the first in that series of 5, and I don't know if Elise, my RA, is still.
Sriram, yes, I don't
here.
use my first name.
Yeah. Sorry, just
Sriram, call me Sriram.
Sorry, just one second. Just was finishing off this question. I don't know if Elise, my RA, is still on here, but if she can, she could put the link in for the series of policy briefs. But there's actually a section in there that talks about the drivers in each of the countries, like what were some of the key driving factors that help to promote the impact bonds market in each of those countries.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Elizabeth, you need to unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Emily, for a very interesting presentation. I really like the idea of the flexibility this type of funding provides, and even that with success, reinvestment can happen. I've been working on a project in Kenya doing screening for school children with to find rheumatic heart disease and then get them into prophylactic treatment. And being a small provider, I'm wondering if there are already, you said that the service providers need to find the intermediary parties. I'm just wondering if there are groups of investors on the front and on the back end that are already there for people who are in certain sectors like, health or heart disease specifically, or is it all geographic? Or, I saw that Sriram had asked about that, and also this, just how to get into and find out.
Yeah. So first of all, I also teach a course on this. So if you're interested in learning more, if this piqued your interest, I teach a course on an e-learning platform called PolicyWare. So policyware.org. It's over a 3-week period of time, and so I go into a lot more details around sort of how to set these up. So there, I think that potentially reaching out to the intermediaries. There's also something called the Outcomes Accelerator, which has a number of, they have opportunities to apply for grants for developing projects. So that's another option. They also have a list of projects that are in the pipeline. So something like screening in schools, I think, is really interesting. I think there's a lot of potential for bringing together multiple interventions, especially in early childhood and in the child welfare space, or social protection and early childhood space, where multiple types of services add up to positive outcomes, right? And that's, I think, an area that's a little bit untapped. We have some, like one in Ohio that's super interesting that does that, which is about taking kids who are placed in out-of-home care and reuniting them with the families. But yeah, I think that there is a lot of potential there and interest. So, but I think it's also important to note, I mean, it makes sense at larger scale. It's pretty time consuming and resource intensive to set this up for something very small. And so, but I do think that something that service providers can do is to build that evidence, to build the evidence that demonstrating, having evaluations done and demonstrating the impacts of different types of interventions. I think that's really important. Being sort of like, we talk about service provider readiness. Service provider readiness is kind of about, it's about that performance management aspect, like the monitoring and evaluation, being able to collect the data and adapt and learn, et cetera. I think it's a really interesting opportunity for empowering service providers. I think that there's, and that's a shift from kind of traditional results-based financing where it was very much sort of like metrics were set on service providers, and service providers were like, okay, we want money. Okay, we can do that, right? But this is much more of a co-created process, I think, with service providers, and like being given that capital to, and sort of the trust to, okay, like do what you need to do, best as a service provider, how to get to those outcomes. So, in that sense, I think it's a really interesting kind of opportunity.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great. Thank you.
I saw something that Heather and Brad put in the chat. Did you want to jump in?
Can you see? Yeah, Heather, go ahead if you have some.
It's actually me again. So yeah, I kind of got a whiff of this back in 2017 and 18, and was self-funding to go to impact investing conferences in Europe. And it was very clear to me that the Europeans were way, way, way ahead of us in the United States as far as impact investment generally, but especially with regard to impact investment bonds and development impact investment bonds. So it's exceptionally heartening to have a talk today, and not just validating, but also giving a lot more substance than someone like a participant like myself could have given. There's an organization called the Global Impact Investing Network that is a nonprofit organization that I would love to hear your thoughts on as far as a resource for those of us looking to move into this area and move our organizations towards collaborating to put together development impact bonds and looking towards impact investment and social entrepreneurship actually as a way forward in development as opposed to the traditional grant structure. And I'll leave it there.
Sure. Yeah. So the GIN, I think that they've done a really excellent job in terms of like putting out the data around kind of assets under management and the trends that we're seeing in the impact investing space. They haven't really gone down the pathway too much around outcomes-based financing. So I have spent a lot of time in impact investing conferences. And one thing that I think, and I have sat on many a panel where impact investors say you can't measure impact, and have found that very frustrating because in fact you can measure the impact of many things, I think. And I think that that's actually, I think outcomes-based financing has actually really brought that to the forefront. Yeah, there are really concrete measures of outcome achievement, not just outputs, but outcome achievement. And so I kind of think that that's like I think that that's the way to go. And kind of, it's kind of beyond impact investing. It is impact investing, but it's beyond impact investing. So the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing has done some interesting work, GSG. They have their annual conference. It's no, sorry, it's not the GSG that has their annual. They do have an annual conference. There's the, I'm not sure if you work at all in Latin America, but and or if you speak Spanish, but there's a Latin American impact investing network that's also doing some really interesting work. There's certainly, and again, I think we should probably talk offline, but there are definitely ways to get engaged in this space more, and there's a lot more happening, and I think definitely beyond GIN.
So Emily, I will have one last question and that will conclude. You have been too generous, 1 hour, 1.5 hours already. So this is just for myself and many of the people in the audience are graduate students. So from your experience and from your point of view in the area of impact investing, what are some of the questions burning questions that needs to be addressed? So like, let's say, so research point of view, that is one. And second one is where do you see it is going? where is the max potential for impact investing, particularly in developing country context or Western countries? In which sector, in which area you see that it is going to grow and it has potential in terms of looking at you have looked at the entire spectrum of the projects, right? The returns, economics, impacts, and challenges of rolling it out. So where do you see it is going and maximum potential?
Sure. So, I mean, broadly, in terms of impact investing, I think we're going to continue to see growth in impact investing space. Also starting to see sort of foundations that are looking at their endowments to invest, and a lot of just really interesting things happening, like crowdsourcing for paying for outcomes. Yeah, just I think there's a lot of interest. I think there's a push, there's a need. There's an acknowledgement that, you know, government budgets are constrained, et cetera, and really demand to see the achievement of outcomes. You know, far too much money is going into things that aren't achieving outcomes, including in high income countries, including this one. You know, I think that we're going to see a push farther in that direction. You know, I think that where outcomes-based, so just shifting now to outcomes-based financing and social development impact bonds in particular, I think that we also will see a growth there. I think that the kind of the big thing and over the coming years will be outcomes funds. So the pooling of funding on the outcomes side and pooling of funding on the investment side. So we see there's a large impact investing fund for low middle income countries that's in development currently. There's one of those, at least one of those in the US that we've been following closely for US projects. And I think, you know, donors will increasingly be demanding outcomes. There are some donors that are more, I would say, that are going to be more engaged in this than others. We've seen a little bit of like a fluctuation, which has been sort of a political kind of ebb and flow, I would say. But yeah, and like what needs to happen is sort of an establishment around metrics, around benchmarking, around pricing, and some standardization of contracts, transparency around contracts. So you know, the key players in this space, you know, I think have a big responsibility, and some of them are definitely, you know, stepping up and doing that, and others I think are being less transparent. So our hope is that we continue to see more transparency among the different stakeholders, to share also, you know, what they've learned, what didn't work, the projects that failed, the projects that didn't launch. So we'll be doing some work looking at that in the future, kind of what can we learn from those that didn't launch, those that did, in the process. So definitely a lot to learn, and like I said, you know, there's a lot we don't know. Many of these, like, you know, we don't know the counterfactual, and we see a lot of potential, and I think, you know, a lot of promise, but we need to also ask the hard questions, like cost versus benefits, et cetera. Like, is there a less expensive way to go about this? You know, which of those factors in my theory of change there sort of are the key driving factors? Can any of those be done sort of in a less costly way, et cetera? So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So with this, we will conclude. Thank you, Emily, for wonderful presentation. And I have already received many emails about getting access to your talks. I'll be sharing the video and everything. So thank you for doing it. Thank you everyone for participating today, and have a wonderful day. And Emily, I hope to meet you when I visit DC.
Yes, let me know when you're in DC, and thanks for all of the fantastic questions. Great to have such a diverse and active group.
Oh, thank you
very much. Really appreciate it. Eye-opening.
All the best. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Okay.
You
Bye.
too.